They didn't throw me out. They didn't shout or curse or slam doors. They did something worse. They decided I no longer mattered. At 80 years old, my own son and daughter-in-law sent me away to a boarding house, convinced my life was already over. They were wrong. My name is Eleanor Whitman, and I was 80 years old when my family decided I was done living. People assume old age comes with confusion, weakness, or surrender. That's the first mistake they make. I was perfectly clear-minded the day my son told me I needed to leave his house. Daniel stood across from me in the living room. He couldn't look me in the eye. His wife, Melissa, sat beside him, back straight, expression controlled like this was a necessary business decision. "It's for your comfort," she said. "You'll have people your age, nurses, structure." Structure, a word younger people use when they want control without guilt. I had lived in that house for nearly 2 decades. I helped pay for it. I helped raise their children. I cooked, cleaned, stayed quiet, learned when to disappear. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being a person and became a background object. And objects get replaced. I didn't argue. I didn't remind them of sacrifices or love or loyalty. At 80, I had learned something. Valuable people who decide to abandon. You don't deserve explanations. So I packed one suitcase. The boarding house was clean but lifeless. Beige walls, polite smiles. Everyone there had the same story, just told differently, families who moved on and called it care. That first night, I sat alone on the narrow bed and listened to the silence. No television, no footsteps, no voices asking if I needed anything. And that's when it hit me. I was free. No one watching. No one dismissing me. No one telling me I was too old to understand money, decisions, or power. I had spent my life managing finances quietly, balancing accounts, stretching dollars, making smart choices while louder people took credit. I knew how systems worked because I survived them. Old age didn't dull my instincts. It sharpened them. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, wrinkled skin, steady eyes. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't angry. I was focused. They sent me away believing I would fade. Instead, they handed me the one thing I hadn't had in years: time to rebuild myself. And this time, I would build something so large, so undeniable, that forgetting me would be impossible. I didn't tell anyone my plans. At 80, people mistake silence for emptiness. I let them. The boarding house had a small common room where residents gathered every morning, pretending to read newspapers they barely touched. I sat there too, listening. You learn more when you don't speak. That's how I met Harold Bennett. He was 76, sharp-eyed, restless, and deeply unhappy to be there. Everyone knew he'd once been someone, though no one knew exactly what that meant. People like to exaggerate the past when they've lost control of the present. One morning, he muttered to himself about a missed opportunity. I looked up. "Opportunities don't disappear," I said calmly. "They just wait for better timing." He stared at me, surprised. "You don't sound like the others," he replied. That was the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Harold and I spoke every morning. Not about our families, we both knew better, but about markets, mistakes, and money. He had been a mid-level investor in his younger years. Not famous, not wildly successful, but experienced. I told him what I hadn't told anyone else. I had savings. Not extravagant, but untouched, carefully protected. Money I never trusted my son or daughter-in-law to manage. "You're 80, he said once, not unkindly. "What do you want to do with it?" I didn't hesitate. "I want it to grow," I said, quietly. Harold smiled. That was the moment I knew he understood me. We started small. Online trading platforms. Low-risk entries. I watched every movement like a hawk. Age didn't slow my learning, it removed my fear. I had already lost everything that mattered socially. What was left to be afraid of? At night, I studied. I remembered patterns. I followed instincts sharpened by decades of survival. My first profit wasn't dramatic, just enough to confirm something important: I still had it. No one at the boarding house noticed the change. Not the way I sat straighter. Not the way my eyes calculated instead of drifted. Daniel never called. Melissa never checked in. That silence became fuel. I didn't want revenge. I wanted independence so complete that their opinions would never touch me again. One evening, Harold leaned back in his chair and laughed softly. "You know," he said, "if you'd started earlier, you'd be dangerous." I looked at him. "I didn't start late," I replied. "I started free." That night, I checked my account again. The numbers were still modest but moving, alive. For the first time since they sent me away, I slept deeply. They thought 80 meant the end. They had no idea my foundation was already set. If there's one advantage to being 80, it's this: people stop expecting you to be brave. They also stop trying to stop you. By the third month at the boarding house, my routine was invisible. Morning coffee, afternoon walks, evening television I barely watched. No one suspected that every night, after the hallway lights dimmed, I sat at my small desk, with a laptop and made decisions that would terrify people half my age. Harold watched quietly. He never interfered unless I asked. That restraint told me more about him than his resume ever could. One evening, I showed him a screen. "This is reckless," he said after a long pause. I smiled. "No," I replied. "This is early." The opportunity was a struggling logistics tech company based in Texas, overshadowed, undervalued, poorly marketed. The kind of company analysts ignored because it wasn't flashy enough. But I recognized the structure. I had seen this before: businesses that failed not because they were weak, but because they were misunderstood. Harold shook his head. At my age, I interrupted gently, "I don't have time for safe boredom." I invested. Not everything. I'm not foolish. But enough to matter. The next 2 weeks were agony. The stock dipped. Forums panicked. Analysts scoffed. Harold didn't say "I told you so," which I appreciated. Then the contract news broke. A major national retailer signed on. Overnight, the numbers shifted. Slowly at first, then violently upward. I stared at the screen, unmoving. I wasn't excited. I was confirmed. That night, I didn't celebrate. I adjusted, reinvested, diversified. The goal wasn't to win, it was momentum. People think success feels loud. It doesn't. It feels quiet and controlled. Like holding your breath underwater and realizing you're not drowning. Weeks later, the boarding house manager knocked on my door. "We're reviewing resident finances," she said awkwardly. "Just standard procedure." I nodded politely, knowing exactly what she would find. After that, staff attitudes shifted. Respect crept in, uninvited. People sensed change before they understood it. Daniel still hadn't called. I checked my phone one evening and felt nothing. That's when I knew something had truly changed. I wasn't building a comeback to prove anything to my family. I was building it because I liked who I was becoming: decisive, unafraid, unburdened. Harold raised his cup toward me one morning. "You realize," he said, "this is only the beginning." I met his gaze. "I know," I replied. "And this time, I won't stop halfway." At 80, I had taken a risk they said I shouldn't. And it paid me back with something far more valuable than money: control. Money changes people long before it changes their lifestyle. I felt it happening inside me: not greed, not arrogance, but precision. By the 4th month, my account no longer looked like a hobby. It looked like intent. I knew better than to celebrate early. Wealth that arrives loudly disappears the same way. So I did what I had always done best in life: I moved quietly. One afternoon, I left the boarding house alone and took a cab downtown. The driver asked where my family was. I smiled and said nothing. At 80, silence is a luxury people underestimate. I walked into a small legal office tucked between a dry cleaner and a dentist. No glass towers. No arrogance. Just competence. I want to register an LLC, I told the young attorney. Discreet, clean, no publicity. He glanced at me, surprised, then nodded. We spent 2 hours discussing structure, liability, and anonymity. He spoke slowly, as if expecting confusion. I corrected him twice. By the end, his tone had changed. The name I chose mattered. Not emotional, not sentimental, strategic. Whitman Strategic Holdings. No family names. No connections. Just a clean slate. When I signed the papers, my hand didn't shake. That surprised even me. I realized something in that moment. This wasn't revenge. This was alignment. My age, my experience, my patience, all finally pointed in the same direction. Back at the boarding house, nothing looked different. Same beige walls. Same tired smiles. But I wasn't the same woman who had arrived with one suitcase. Harold noticed first. You crossed a line today, he said that evening. Yes, I replied. The right one. With the LLC in place, doors opened silently. Better platforms. Private investment groups. Conversations people don't invite elderly residents into unless they bring value. And I did. I began placing capital where others hesitated. Infrastructure, long-term logistics. Boring industries people my son would never brag about. The returns were slow, then steady, then undeniable. One night, as I reviewed numbers, my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. Hey Mom, just checking in. Hope you're okay. I stared at it for a long time. Then I locked my phone and went back to work. Not out of anger, out of focus. The next morning, the boarding house manager asked if I'd consider moving to a more suitable place. Her voice was careful now, respectful. I smiled. Not yet, I said. I'm not finished here. Because before I could leave that place, before I could rise publicly, I needed to finish building privately. They thought sending me away had stripped me of identity. In truth, it had given me the space to create one they would never recognize until it was too late. Wealth has a sound. It isn't loud or flashy, it's deliberate. By the time the call came, I had learned to recognize it. It was late afternoon when my secure phone rang. An unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but instinct told me otherwise. At 80, instinct is earned. Miss Whitman, a man said smoothly. This is Jonathan Hale. I represent a private capital group. We've been tracking Whitman Strategic Holdings. Tracking. The word settled in my chest. I listened without interrupting as he spoke about my positions, my timing, the way my investments moved before market sentiment shifted. He didn't flatter. He evaluated. That told me everything I needed to know. You're disciplined, he said, and invisible. That combination is rare. We met 2 days later in a quiet restaurant, the kind without signs or music. Jonathan was in his 40s, composed, expensive without being obvious. He expected hesitation. Instead, I asked him one question. How much control do you want? He smiled. Less than you think. That was the beginning. Jonathan introduced me to capital I had never touched before. Serious money. Cautious money. Money that expected leadership, not noise. They didn't care about my age. They cared about results. And I had those. I expanded carefully. Logistics became infrastructure. Infrastructure became regional dominance. Every move layered, protected, intentional. The numbers grew faster than even I anticipated. Harold watched from the sidelines, impressed but quiet. One evening, he said something that stayed with me. They'll find out eventually. Yes, I replied. But not until it benefits me. The boarding house started feeling temporary in a new way. Not like exile, like camouflage. Then, one morning, I saw Melissa's name pop up on my phone. I didn't answer. Not because I was bitter, because I was busy closing a deal that would multiply my net worth beyond anything my family could imagine. By the end of that quarter, Whitman's strategic holdings crossed into 9 figures. I didn't celebrate. I adjusted strategy. Because wealth isn't about rival. It's about sustainability. At 80, I wasn't chasing validation. I was building something permanent, something that would outlive the people who had underestimated me. And for the first time, the world was beginning to notice. Success has a moment when hiding no longer serves you. I reached mine quietly, over black coffee and a signed contract. Jonathan sat across from me, papers spread neatly on the table. The deal was too large to remain anonymous. Media wouldn't chase my face, but my name would surface. That was the price of scale. "You're ready," he said. "Whether you want to be or not." I nodded. "I've been ready longer than you think." Whitman Strategic Holdings merged into a larger infrastructure fund. My position shifted from silent investor to principal stakeholder. Overnight, my net worth crossed into territory most people only read about. I didn't move out immediately. Power reveals itself best when it waits. Then came the invitation an economic development gala in Manhattan. Black tie, donors, cameras, I almost declined, almost. But something inside me said it was time. I arrived early, dressed simply, elegantly. No jewelry that screamed money. Just confidence that didn't ask permission. People didn't recognize me yet. That was fine. Jonathan introduced me as our lead strategist. Faces changed. Hands extended. Respect recalibrated in real time. I watched it happen with calm curiosity. Then I heard a voice I hadn't expected. "Wad." I turned. Daniel stood frozen near the bar, older, thinner, unprepared. Melissa was beside him, smiling politely until she saw my face. Her smile vanished. For a moment, no one spoke. I didn't rush to explain. I didn't apologize for my success. I simply met my son's eyes. "Hello, Daniel," I said warmly. "It's good to see you." Melissa recovered first. She always did. "We didn't know you were involved in this world." I smiled. "I wasn't, once." The conversation was brief, professional, civil, devastating in its restraint. They left early. Later that night, Jonathan raised his glass. "You handled that with grace." I nodded. "Grace isn't weakness," I said. "It's control." When I returned to the boarding house that evening, I packed my suitcase, the same one I'd arrived with. It felt symbolic. At the door, Harold watched silently. "You won't be coming back," he said. "No," I replied. "But I'll remember who I was here. Because this place didn't break me. It refined me." And now, the world would meet Eleanor Whitman not as someone's mother, not as someone's burden, but as exactly who I had become. It didn't happen overnight. Change rarely announces itself with fanfare. But when my family realized, Eleanor Whitman, the quiet, 80-year-old they thought powerless, was now untouchable, everything shifted. Daniel and Melissa first noticed subtle things. Invitations sent to my office instead of my home. Emails carbon copied to major investors. Conference calls they couldn't intercept. Their casual assumptions that I was invisible were crumbling. I didn't reach out. I didn't flaunt. I let them discover, piece by piece, that sending me to a boarding house had been the easiest mistake of their lives. One afternoon, Daniel called. His voice wavered, not anger, not guilt, just unsteady confusion. "Mom, I heard about your fund." "How?" I interrupted him gently. "I built it, Daniel. Just like I've always built everything, quietly, with patience and discipline." There was a pause. I knew he realized he had underestimated me for decades. That silence was the acknowledgement of all the times he had dismissed my advice, my decisions, my instincts. Melissa tried a different approach. She sent a corporate gift basket, expensive, branded, polite. It wasn't a gesture for me. It was a message to my advisors, a desperate attempt to insert herself into a world she had long ignored. I laughed softly when I received it, not cruelly but with awareness. The world had changed. They hadn't. Later that week, a minor local news outlet ran a short profile on Whitman Strategic Holdings. I stayed off camera, but my name made the headlines. Daniel read it in the morning paper and dropped it onto the kitchen table of my old home with a resigned expression. Melissa, who had meticulously tried to erase me, no longer had the luxury of ignoring my existence. I didn't gloat. I just kept moving. Investments, partnerships, acquisitions. My empire expanded silently, confidently, almost invisibly. The best kind of power doesn't announce itself. It just exists, inevitable. When Daniel reached out again, this time asking for advice on an investment, I paused before replying. I considered what I had learned about respect, about boundaries, about reclaiming what is yours. Finally, I said, "I'll help, but only if you listen this time." It was the first time he truly heard me, not as his mother, but as someone who had mastered the game he thought he understood. And that's when I realized something profound. The boarding house hadn't been my exile. It had been my crucible. They had tried to break me. Instead, they had forged me. Eleanor Whitman, 80 years old, invisible to the world they controlled, had returned not just rich, but unshakable. I had learned a truth few understand. Power isn't claimed, it's recognized. Whitman Strategic Holdings had grown beyond what anyone, including me, had anticipated. What started as careful investments in overlooked sectors had transformed into multi-billion-dollar holdings, logistics, real estate, tech infrastructure. I didn't flaunt it. I didn't need to. The numbers spoke louder than press releases. One crisp morning in Manhattan, Jonathan Hale and I walked into a boardroom that overlooked the skyline. The room was quiet, tense with expectation. Investors, analysts, and executives, people I had never met in person, waited. They expected cautious statements, timid negotiation. They got Eleanor Whitman. I presented projections, acquisitions, and growth plans with calm authority. Every word measured, every number deliberate. Not once did anyone doubt me. Not once did they challenge the decisions. Because I wasn't asking for respect. I had already earned it. Meanwhile, back home, Daniel and Melissa could no longer ignore what they had unleashed. Emails leaked. Headlines surfaced. Forbes quietly mentioned Whitman Strategic Holdings as a rising powerhouse led by a seasoned strategist. Social media discussions debated my anonymity. Before the picture finally surfaced, a composed woman, grey-haired, eye sharp, suit impeccable, standing tall in the corner of a sleek office. Daniel called. Again, this time urgency colored his voice. "Mom, I didn't realize." I held the phone loosely. "Didn't realize what, Daniel?" "That's this. You're managing billions. You, 80 years old," I finished for him. "And yes, I am managing billions. And no, your opinions no longer matter in my decisions." Melissa tried her usual manipulation, sweet voice, soft tones, but Daniel interrupted. Hesitation in his own voice. He had seen the transformation. The woman he underestimated was now unstoppable. The boarding house faded from memory. It had been a stepping stone, a place where the world could no longer see me. And in that invisibility, I rebuilt myself. Now the world was seeing Eleanor Whitman, not as an 80-year-old former mother-in-law, but as a force in finance and infrastructure. Harold, still my silent advisor from the boarding house days, said quietly, "I think they finally understand." I nodded. "Yes," I said. "They understand, but only partially. Because the full scale of my empire, my strategy, my patience, they still had no idea. The best part, that revelation would come, slowly." By now, Whitman Strategic Holdings had become a name no one could casually dismiss. Billion-dollar acquisitions, strategic mergers, and silent dominance in multiple industries had elevated me far beyond anything Daniel and Melissa could imagine. When they sent me away to that boarding house, the first time they truly faced it wasn't in a conversation. It was in a conference room. I had arranged a small, private meeting under the guise of family reconciliation. Daniel arrived, confused. Melissa followed, wearing that practiced smile that always tried to hide fear. Neither expected what they would see. On the table, I laid out a detailed portfolio of my investments, property holdings in 3 states, equity in a top logistics firm, and a newly acquired tech startup on the rise. Every number was precise, every projection backed by research and data. Daniel's face paled. Melissa's composure faltered. You own all this?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I replied calmly. "And I built it all after you sent me away." Melissa's hands trembled. "Eleanor, we didn't think." "Exactly," I interrupted. "You didn't think an 80-year-old woman could rebuild herself. You didn't think she could leverage experience, patience, and silence into something formidable. And now you see the cost of underestimating me." For the first time, I watched them understand the magnitude of their mistake. It wasn't anger I felt toward them, it was clarity. They had tried to erase me, but in doing so, they gave me the freedom to rise. I leaned back in my chair, watching Daniel fidget. "You see, sending me away wasn't punishment. It was the beginning of my empire. Your rejection gave me invisibility. That invisibility gave me strategy. That strategy gave me power." Melissa tried to interject, but I held up a hand. "No apologies necessary. The lesson is already learned. Your role in my life remains limited. I will be generous, but I will not be controlled." Daniel finally nodded, a mix of respect and shame in his eyes. For the first time, he saw me not as his mother, not as a family member to be dismissed, but as a formidable, self-made force. I could have gloatingly reminded them of every meal I had cooked, every hour I had sacrificed, every corner of their lives I had shaped, but I didn't. The weight of my accomplishments spoke louder than words ever could. When they left the room, I sat quietly and smiled. Not at them, at myself, at the journey from boarding house, exile to commanding presence in boardrooms, across the country. They had sent me away, thinking I was powerless. Now I was untouchable. 80 years old, sent away, forgotten, underestimated. And yet, here I was, Eleanor Whitman, billionaire, strategist, and untouchable. The final step wasn't about proving anything to Daniel or Melissa. They had already witnessed my success. It was about claiming my life fully on my terms. In the world I had built from nothing, I moved into my own penthouse overlooking Manhattan, a space that reflected decades of patience, skill, and vision. Modern, sleek, minimal. No family portraits, no reminders of the past. Just me, the skyline, and everything I had achieved. Whitman Strategic Holdings was no longer silent. I hired a small, trusted team. They knew my age, respected my wisdom, and followed my decisions without question. Each acquisition, each partnership, each new venture became a testament to strategy, discipline, and foresight. I received a call from a major media outlet requesting an interview. I agreed, but on my terms. They expected the frail, elderly grandmother story. Instead, I walked in with confidence, composure, and clarity. I spoke about markets, growth, and investment strategy with authority. Cameras recorded every word, but my message was simple: experience is power, age is strategy, underestimation is opportunity. Daniel and Melissa finally reached out, not for apologies, but for reconciliation and guidance. I listened. I offered mentorship in controlled doses. They would never control me again, never. The balance had shifted. Respect, not fear, defined our new dynamic. I reflected on my journey from that quiet boarding house to a billion-dollar empire. The house that had seemed like exile had been my crucible. Every setback, every dismissal, every moment of invisibility had forged the woman I had become. I realized something essential: success isn't revenge. It's reclamation. Not of wealth alone, but of self-respect, dignity, and choice. I had reclaimed my narrative, my power, and my life. As I stood on the balcony of my penthouse, looking over the city lights, I smiled. They had thought sending me away was the end. It was only the beginning. Eleanor Whitman, 80, unstoppable, untouchable, had arrived.